I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This is session 6 of our CISO Cyber series. That's really hard to say, folks. Today's title is Continuous Security Validation. Is all that money you're spending paying off? Just to keep a couple of housekeeping items. If you have technical difficulties along the way, feel free to reach out to me. You can either put that in a chat or QA box or send me an email if you can't work with the Zoom. Secondly, we are recording this and we will make the recording available within the next 24 hours out on our YouTube channel. And the final thing is we aren't going to do a lot of slides today. This is definitely a town hall series. We want you to participate in this. While we're doing the panelist discussion, feel free to put questions in the chat box or Q&A. And then once we get through with the chat, we'll open up the Q&A and you can actually ask live questions. So let me flip over to a couple of things here while we get started. First of all, let me introduce our panelists today. First of all is Corey White. He's the founder and CEO of Cybetar. Chris Kennedy, he's the CISO and VP of Customer Success over at Attack IQ. And Craig Goodwin, the Chief Trust and Risk Officer over at Fujitsu. Corey, I'm going to pass this off to you.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Thanks, Terry. I skipped my introduction, but Chris, want to give kind of a deep dive of your history and background, which we talked to last week, and you have a great background, so you got to talk about where you come from.
Oh man, yeah. So, some would say I might be a sadist or like to hurt myself. I have about a 25 harrowing years of operating in some of the craziest cultured environments you could ever work in. I was one of the Marine Corps' first official cybersecurity officers. I was the ISO for Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, the biggest base in the late 90s when cybersecurity was like emerging as a practitioner opportunity, and got to deal with like the first realization of public state-sponsored attacks, the programs centered in vulnerability management, antivirus management, and changing passwords. I was promoted out of that to basically build the Security Operations Center for the Marine Corps, the Enterprise SOC. Back before concepts of SIM existed, log aggregation was being born, intrusion detection systems were just rolling out. And then from that, I transitioned to defense contracting and had the opportunity over a decade to build and transform the U.S. Department of Treasury Cybersecurity Operations Center. And it was a really cool experience in that we kind of embraced the concept of SecDevOps. Before that was a buzzword. I mean, I had an integrated intelligence, operations, infrastructure, and development function, all tightly cohesively working on a shoestring budget. And it worked. It was really cool. I spent the last 7 years prior to my time at Attack IQ at the largest hedge fund in the world. And there I had a role where I was basically the CISO for the technology organization, and did a lot of work in the risk management, vuln management, and control security, controls engineering side. So I've kind of done it all, in some crazy places. When I say, between the Marine Corps, U.S. government, and financial critical infrastructure institutions. At Attack IQ, as the CISO and VP of Customer Success, I'm focused on what our platform does. We're the industry-leading independent breach and attack simulation platform, as Gartner characterizes it. But we'll talk more about that further in the talk. But I'm also, as a former CISO, the VP of Customer Success, which is a strategic investment for our company to have CISOs, to be able to talk to CISOs about how to operationalize MITRE ATT&CK and build a coherent CSV program.
Perfect. Thank you. Craig, want to jump in?
Nah, it's all right. I think
you're good.
Everybody knows Craig.
Yeah, we're good. So I'm back again. So yeah, Craig Goodwin, similar start to Chris actually. So intelligence services with the UK government for a while, which is where I get my background in intelligence and security from, and then 20 years as a CISO for US-based tech companies mainly. Most recently, and now I am currently Chief Trust and Risk Officer for Fujitsu, which I did look up this time and is officially the 4th largest by revenue IT service provider globally, behind IBM, Accenture, and AWS. There we go, got it right. So I run security for all of the delivery organization. So anywhere we touch a customer, essentially. I also own risk for that part of the business as well. And to Chris's point, which I think would be a really interesting conversation, I also own this kind of new thing to us called trust, which is about using security internally to drive trust and strong conversations with our customers about how we do security well internally, which leads to greater opportunity to service our customers and build trust with our customers. So that's me.
All right. Sounds great. I was just thinking, I feel like crap because I don't know if anybody will let me in their military. I mean, both you guys have that background. That just, I don't know if that's a club I could even get in. Yeah, I feel like it'd be a bad story I'd have to tell after that.
Neither of us dived in to say you could, Corey. Then you could, you absolutely could.
No, I could. Yeah.
If you're the proud Corey, you just gotta want it.
In these times that we have with COVID and quarantine and people stuck at home, Sabotage always wanted to make sure that we were giving back. And it was interesting over the last few weeks. There's so many ways for organizations to give back, and others that I've really started to investigate. B corporations and everything. And one of the things that we did just this past week is one of our customers, had a death in the family, and so normally we would send some flowers, but they can't have a funeral, so we're like, where would we send the flowers to? So what we ended up doing was made a donation on that person's behalf in loving memory to the LA Food Bank, and just now we can track all that, and that's what Sabotage Cares is, and that's what we're going to continue to do. Every time we close a deal, every time we feel we normally give back, we give back by giving to others and in their name. So that's how we're approaching it. This whole webinar series, every single week that we do, we're making sure that all of our technology partners are doing the same things. And of course, we've got zero pushback. Everybody's like, hell yeah, sure. So everybody has their own kind of, thing that they want to donate to. And in this particular case, Frontline Foods. So Chris, tell me about Frontline Foods.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's you. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Frontline Foods is a donation that we make to the local communities to help ensure that, especially when you think about the circumstances that we're in right now with the COVID situation, we went from 3% unemployment to 10% unemployment, where people are shut down. So people are hungry. It's really important that is to your point, that we're giving back. And we want to make sure that we have a conduit as a way to be able to take care of folks in trying times. And so Frontline Foods is a premier organization to help us with that. And we think it's a good one to, especially in the times that we're in, to be able to help take care of people that are struggling.
That's fantastic. Thank you, guys. We appreciate that. Let's move on. So like we said, no slide deck. This is really us just talking about cybersecurity. It's interesting. As normal, I'm gonna talk about something different and get started off differently. I was on a sales call. I think it was a couple of days ago. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a CISO there, and he's CISO of it's a Fortune 25 company, and global company. I think 60,000 employees, and we're just going through everything we do at Sabotage and how we approach cybersecurity. And I brought up you guys. I said, security validation, how do you do it? I mean, you've got some technologies in place, you're doing some things. How do you know it's working? And he came back and he was like, we don't. We have no freaking idea. We hope. And it was like 10 people on the call. It has whole security management team on, but he has like 90 people worldwide. But he's like, we don't. And so it was interesting to hear that perspective. How do you guys, how do we solve this? Like you think, and I'll start with you, Craig. Security spend is, I think you did some research this week. Was it like some percentage? I'll let you share whatever that was. But how do you know it's working? You spend this money, how do you know it works?
Right. So Where to start? I think the first thing is what my first point on that would be, and I'll let Chris give you the answer because clearly those guys are trying to solve that problem. I think from an internal CISO's perspective, I would go first and say, what the hell does works mean, right? Like how do you know your controls are working, and what does work even mean, right? So I think if you look at the CISO community, it's generally accepted when we speak about it that something's going to happen, right? You're going to get breached, and for a long time people talked about it's not if but when, right, and all that kind of thing. So I think works is something quite difficult to define. To your point, Corey, I went down a horrible rabbit hole of economics of cybersecurity this week when I was looking for some research-based stuff, and I dived into some books. I should really quote them here. I'll have Terry send them out in the notes or the comments or something. But so I've got proper references. But you know, they were talking about the cost to implement security versus the chances of being breached, and trying to really quantify risk. And I think in summary of this like 300-page document that I was reading, it came out at like 37% of your overall expected breach cost should be the amount of money that you spend on controls. And that's the premium point, right? So when you get to that point, the two diagrams intersect and you get to the perfect amount of spending on security. Now, loads of holes in that, right? How much is a breach going to cost? All those kind of things. But that's the thing, right? And I think so I would leave it with a couple of things, and then I'll let Chris dive in. I think one, we need to define what works mean. We can't bring it down to zero. So what is enough work and what is enough controls to bring yourself to a position where you're comfortable and you're managing your risk appetite, right? I think that's number one in terms of discussion. And then number two, I would say it's got to come back to quantification and cost, right? So how much you're spending versus how much risk you're transferring. I think those conversations have got to be the place to start.
Yeah, that really resonates with me too. Like what you said about what does work mean. How many of our listeners have ever bought a security product with poor functional requirements?
Yeah.
All of us. Like, and so what influences the sales strategy? Well, it will address Russian hackers. It will defend against these kinds of attacks. But the definition of works has been a real challenge. I'll talk about more of that in a second. Let's talk about the art of what is. Like, how do we validate our security controls today? You have an audit team in many cases, or a blue team that in a regulated institution is largely anchored to a regulatory framework. So basically, they're answering that mail. It's not exclusively about protecting the business. It's about getting the regulator off your back. You may do some form of red teaming or testing, like in whatever lens of that. That's ambiguous too, to your point, Craig. What's a red team? Because depending on how you scope that, it can be a vulnerability sweep to reverse engineering an application. So it depends on how you set the rules of engagement and do that. But the reality is, the biggest part of the problem, the two biggest parts of the problem, is Craig's point of what does work mean? And then if you look at this thing as the second part is, if you look at this like an engineering problem, I'm a systems engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer by education, and I worked in an integrator for 10 years. Validation is a integral component to complex system engineering problem. And our validation functionality is the two things I just defined. It is largely a regulator-driven compliance initiative driven by an audit that you do temporally once a year, or a red team that has scope all over the place and is very expensive, hard to repeat, and can be misaligned. And not to discredit the red teaming as a service community, like they do great work. It's just, it's not scalable, and it's ambiguous. So those are the two big things. And then it's interesting to me, what I'm perceiving in the community is this pivot to an understanding of how do I know it works versus the assumption that it does work. How many buyers buy a product to think that it's just going to work out of the box, or because I've acquired a solution but haven't actually checked it that it does. And so that's the space we've been operating in for 20 years. And every incident that I've been involved in as an operational practitioner, I can personally attest that I had everything I needed. I just didn't know my stuff wasn't working. And sometimes that stuff wasn't working because of me in my process. It wasn't working because the technology itself had failed silently, or I didn't have good operational oversight over it. And so that's a very interesting paradigm, and how the industry is as big as it is that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, and if you think, to your point, Chris, about talking about what we can actually do about that, so the things about that conversation that we can impact directly. If you think about it as CISOs, I often talk about defining your objectives as reducing the risk, as opposed to providing visibility or doing what the tool says, right? So to take a micro example of what you're talking about, as a CISO, I might say, well, I've succeeded because I've got Nessus and Qualys running, right? And I'm getting results out of them.
Right.
Therefore, I've succeeded, right? I'm doing what I need to do. Well, that's okay if that's what you define as your success criteria. But actually, as an organizational function, you've got to get that outcome. You've got to drive to the point where those risks are reduced and removed. And it's going that extra step further, right?
Yeah, like the big picture of all of that stuff I just said is that, what are security organizations measured and benchmarked against? What are your KPIs?
Yeah.
And the reality is, like, we've not had a good way to actually anchor to key performance indicators. I use a link that I found on LinkedIn from a former CISO, I think it was BBVA, and he showed how he created this slick little Excel spreadsheet to articulate the CSC 20 in a control maturity assessment. And he gave his board briefing. He said the residual risk of the organization anchored across these spectrum of control families is 17%. And like, I see the intellectual value that brings, but it actually means absolutely nothing. Like, it is just a made up subjective assessment to give an uninformed board feedback that I'm doing work.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem for CISOs. And that's why you see the problems in the CISO community. 2-year life cycle, chief information scapegoat officer.
Yep.
You know, we all have drinking problems. You know, these are real.
Wait, I got to jump in. You guys brought up a great point. When you talk about, I think, Greg, you mentioned you got, Nessus and Qualys is scanning, and it says, hey, you got vulnerabilities, and then that's defined as success. That, to me, and this is a horrible example, but I think it's a great example at the same time. It's just like you getting the COVID-19 test and saying you have COVID-19, but you don't get a ventilator, you don't go to the hospital, you don't get anything. It's not the remediation piece of it. You aren't fixing it, but you're like, I'm successful. Hey, I got you tested. In America, we can't get people tested either, but still. But the thing, I got you tested. And that's what we're saying in cybersecurity. When there's so much on the line, and even while I like the COVID example, there's so much on the line, and we're barely breaking the surface. We're just doing the testing. We aren't actually doing the fixes.
It's like the automotive example as well that you always hear me use, right? From an automotive perspective, it's like the mechanic turning up and saying, your car's shocking, it ain't going to get you anywhere, like you can't drive that thing, and then just walking away and leaving you to it, right? The brakes are shot, you're probably going to kill yourself, and then just walking away without any kind of help at all to fix it. And that, with development organizations and with IT organizations, tends to be what the security function does, right? I'm being unfair. There are better ones, like the ones that I run, but normally speaking, they tend to sit there and they tend to say, there's all your holes, there's all your stuff that I've dumped out of Qualys, go ahead and fix it. And the key part of all of that, and this comes back to what Chris is saying, what you're saying, is the business context. Like, you need to understand within the business context in which you are operating as a security function. And that's the basis of defining everything, from what your success criteria is, what your risk appetite is, even to the point, like Chris made the point about red team testing. I've run so many red team testing exercises where there's no real defined outcome or criteria, right? And to the point we were making earlier, great, they're always going to get in because it's their job, right? They don't get paid unless they break something or get in. So that's great if you want to go to the nth degree. But for another organization who has a slightly lesser risk appetite or a slightly smaller budget, they need to know what's enough as opposed to what is the nth degree, what's gold plated. So I think all those factors from a business context perspective then help you to understand what is that outcome you're looking for and what is success mean.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we've defined the problem pretty well. I think we kind of our mutual agreement of like why this is so hard. So what's changing, and why I'm excited to do what I do at Attack IQ, and more how this concept of continuous security validation is poised to help. First and foremost, we help to solve the what works part the way that Craig teed this up. The functional requirements is now much easier to define. If the listening community is familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, a MITRE ATT&CK is adversarial tactics, techniques, and procedures, framework, and knowledge, and common knowledge. It is a 7-year understudy of known attacker behaviors that anchors to the specifics of software they use when they're moving through the kill chain, through the protocols and processes that they follow, and how they execute. And with that knowledge, you can take some very, very practical steps. And I want to stop this technique. And right now it's actually manageable. So if you think about what this means, it's interesting, the vulnerability connection, you two just elucidated as well. MITRE created CVE and CVSS as a way to help manage the understanding and the framework around vulnerability management and how to prioritize it. They created a framework that says that this is a vulnerability, it's easy to do, weaponized in the community, applies to many verticals, that's a high score, go deal with that first. Qualys takes that and pulls that data in, and then gives you a way to be able to stare at all that vulnerability and say, this is the stuff I need to fix first. Well, this is what MITRE ATT&CK is beginning to be. Now you have an understanding, so before I leave the vulnerability piece, but that's only solving the part of the initial access. The vulnerability is how the attacker gets a foothold in the environment. Look, you spend X amount, probably 10% of your security budget in that area, but you've got 9 other phases of the attacker kill chain, from harvesting credentials to lateral movement to action on target, exfiltrating data, whatever it may be. That's where most of your security budget goes, and you have no automation or no continuous functionality to deal with that. And we haven't because we didn't have something like MITRE ATT&CK to anchor to. Well, that now exists. So that's exceptionally powerful. You can begin mapping and understanding to the investments you've made, the controls that you've bought, the technologies you've implemented, to the specific techniques in the kill chain that you actually want to defend yourself against, real functional requirements. And then accommodating that is this breach and attack simulation space that's now beginning to flourish, where you can now invoke emulations of those techniques and make sure that control is working. And it's built into our automation platform, so you can do it every day. You don't have to wait on the pen test to come once a year to beat you up to tell you that. You can do that. And that is so meaningful that I think it's positioned to change the structure of how we align our security program investment.
Yeah. So, just real quick, I want to make sure we're settled on the first point, because here's the deal. Are we saying we can't trust, CISOs can't trust their security program? They're putting security programs in place, but you can't trust that it's actually working. Is that the bottom line issue that we're running into right now?
I think so. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. I think, we're all straight shooters here. I think the CISO job's hard. It requires lots of different kinds of skills, technological, soft, EQ, financial. It's damn near impossible. And so, there's an empathy for that, but there's also, because of that subjectivity, a lot of folks defending that budget and defending that pay grade, and, they're doing the best they can with what they got. But the reality is they just don't know. And they're hoping they're not going to get bit. I've lived in that space. Like, man, I hope I don't get fired today.
Yeah. I would say, like we talked about vendors playing devil's advocate, Chris. My argument back to you would be, you're just creating more problems for me. Like, I know I've got shitloads.
Oh, yes.
I know I've got shitloads of things I need to fix. Right? I get it. Like, I need things that's going to fix that shit. Right? I don't need things that are going to find more holes. So.
Yeah. And that's a real point. I've had that happen, is, where I sit today, where like, turn that thing off. I don't need more problems.
Yeah.
But then it turns into both an integrity conversation. Well, then what are you doing? because like this is your core job, is to provide and oversee the risk of the organization. Controls that you believe are working don't appear to be. What are you anchored to in terms of success criteria to your board?
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing. I've had, really good CISO friends, tell me, Corey, I know that's not covered. I don't have the capacity to cover it right now. I don't need you uncovering it and then pointing it out, because then I know about it from a legal perspective. Once I know about it, I should be fixing it, but I don't have the capacity to fix it. So what do we do there?
Yeah.
So I'll throw this back at you. So Chris, you guys will go and say, hey, you CISO, you spent all this money on all these great tools, you've implemented them, and now they're not working. Now when they know they're not working, they actually got to go and fix it. How do you solve that? I mean, that's putting the CISO in a precarious situation.
I'll tell you how to solve it. This is, from my perspective, a board problem. The board isn't asking the right questions. And
they don't know they have the right questions. I mean, they don't know what questions they should be asking.
Right. When the board understands that they need real KPIs, and that there are real KPIs that now can be generated on control performance anchored to real threats, I think the board's going to get educated and start asking the right questions. So to your point, Craig, when you say you got too much shit, it's like, well, wait till the board starts asking this kind of question, and then you're gonna see a massive rotation on doing more of this kind of stuff.
I hate an educated board. Yeah, and I think so. I'd be interested in hearing, Chris. So you kind of came up with two scenarios there, I think, where. So do you see more that there are areas of the control framework missing in organizations, and therefore you point out those holes and say, you need something else to plug this gap? Or do you see more of people have bought the solutions, they're just not functioning correctly? Because I think
I see both. I see a lot of both. I mean, like, first and foremost, let's be clear, like we talked about the control framework. We got here because we can't manage our priorities. Like you guys talked about Qualys and Nessus, and I get this like 10,000 vulnerabilities. I don't know what to do with them. I need a better way to prioritize. I got a control framework. It's the same thing. I've got to make all this stuff work, but none of that is racked and stacked well within the business context of risk that I understand, and what are the key controls and what are the key threats that would take advantage of those controls. And so that's where the maturity in understanding your business context in a connection to the controls that you require and connection to the threats that would be driving why you need those controls is improving. And that's I think revelation one that's underway. And then the other is, it's just so we got too much shit to do, and there's tons of shelfware out there. But the reason why there's tons of shelfware out there is because we bought stuff and tried to map it to all that entire control framework versus deploying it to where it really matters. And so it might be okay to have some gaps in certain areas that are of lower risk or lower impact from a risk perspective. And that's what's so desperately needed. And we have to retool a whole bunch of other things. We have to teach the regulator community that my framework, my compliance framework may be incomplete, but I'm covering the parts that matter most. And here's the rubric that I've created to do that.
You have to show you're working out, right?
Creating that finding on the thing that don't matter. That's right.
Yeah. And I think if I know little about your product at the moment, which is why this conversation is really interesting, but I think there's a danger with that approach, just playing devil's advocate again, that we drive the wrong priorities. So, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think, so me and Corey had an interesting webcast last week or the week before about IT asset management, right? And how basic and fundamental that is to a first step in a strong security program, right? And it's surprised to no one on this call that even the largest organizations kind of struggle with it, right? And it's funny as well, because we had a very similar conversation there that said, well, how the hell as a CISO, after being in the job for 4 years, do you then turn around and say, oh, IT asset management's still bad, by the way, and try and go and solve that problem? But I think, and having little understanding of the product necessarily and talking about general concepts, my fear with something you're talking about would be, you run your simulation, you run your Havoc bug that runs out throughout my infrastructure and says, well, it got into this piece of infrastructure via this route, right? And therefore I go and buy some AI-based, ML-based super tool that would have stopped you doing that, when in reality, I haven't even solved IT asset management yet, and I don't know what my IT assets are. So, I think we need to make sure that we're going through that prioritization of the basics first before we start to solve those really like APT type threats and stuff that perhaps are less of a threat.
Yeah, I won't fight you on that point, Craig. That's like, I'm an old school SANS 20 guy. Al Powler and I did some work when I was at Northrop. Like, you know, I'm all in on that. But here's the thing: like, this isn't about a platform technology. This is about changing process and making it threat informed and requiring validation in everything you do. That's the key point. So when I step back and I look at my customer population today, and why I think this concept of automated continuous security validation is transformative is I've identified 26 individualized use cases across the entire spectrum of the security and technology organization. So give me like 3 seconds or 30 seconds to run through that. Obviously, automated testing makes a lot of sense. Threat modeling, where I can use MITRE ATT&CK to define a new threat that I'm worried about, like the Iranians. What are the Iranians going to do after we blew them up, and am I subject to that? What techniques do they apply? Let me model that based on my controls posture that I have. Very, very powerful. I can map MITRE ATT&CK to my compliance requirements. Like, my compliance requirement says I have to have MFA. I can show you an MFA platform, or I can create a synthetic logon account and see if it can log in or not. And if MFA doesn't work, it works or it doesn't. Like, different ways of meeting the regulatory remit. But I can use an automation platform to do that versus a checkbox. So that's another part. Then you move into like the technology organization, functional requirements. Like, who's the people that buy security controls? How are they baking it off? Now you have an automated platform to bring that kind of capability forward. All the way to how do you add all this together at the CISO level to start creating some form of scorecard around control maturity assessment, and what does it mean for risk? So you take these 26 use cases and together in a dashboard. Now you can actually meaningfully improving security based on real threats. That's what I'm talking about here. It's like, you can use an automation platform like AttackIQ to enable that, but the transformational component within the security organization is the adoption of using threat-informed capabilities. Even talk about operations, but like, Are
we losing Chris here?
I think we might be.
There we go. Well, I was at the punchline. You guys hear me okay? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I need to talk about operations. Like, what's the most important security control in an organization today? It's the SOC. And what is this? What is the SOC? Why do I say that? Well, one, preventive controls stop the business, right? Like, you can't firewall block everything bad. Like, that's impossible based on the nature of how threats operate today. Detective controls are highly critical. And there's a highly complex ecosystem of things that connect together to make the SOC effective. The sensors, the network and endpoint sensors, the SIM technologies, the correlation logic, the SOAR platforms, the workflow solutions, the threat intelligence integration. Like, one break in that thing, and the poor analyst sitting there that is the most important control in the environment doesn't work. And that person doesn't have a shot. And so you've got to have a life cycle around exercising that muscle. You can't learn that on the breach day. So like I've just ticked through like 7 different places that automated security validation increase the value of the program and create demonstrable evidence of success. And that's what CISOs need to be thinking about. That's what I'm thinking about. That's how I've gotten burned.
You said a magic word for me, and there's so much we could talk about here. But when you think about I'm probably gonna have SOC analysts picketing outside my house here when I say this. But the thing is, you think about a SOC analyst, and I've done some of this in the past in the consulting capacity, but the bottom line is that you're waiting for something to happen. You're waiting for something to happen, and you're responding to that happening. And there are companies that have a whole SOC, a whole team of SOC analysts waiting for something to happen. I think that's flawed. I really, really do.
Yeah.
And I don't think nothing's 100%, but just like me saying, hey, I'm just waiting till I get COVID, which may not be a bad strategy because then I can have the antibodies in me, but whatever. But you're waiting for something to happen. Why can't you focus on preventing those things from happening? I do not think we spend enough time preventing those things from happening. And so I don't know, maybe this is for you, Craig, but you think about these large companies with these SOCs in place. What do those guys do? They just wait until an incident happens, and there's all these companies saying you will get compromised. It's gonna happen. So when it happens, you gotta be prepared. I frankly would rather not live that way, and maybe that's just my philosophy. But I'm curious.
Well, and unfortunately, it's a case of having to in most cases, right? Would be my direct answer. I think to Chris's point about it being a difficult job, you got to do. There's no getting away from the fact that you got to do both, right? You got to have resilience, and I keep mentioning it, but there is From Great to Good. It's a really good book, but it talks about 10x leaders and stuff. And when it talks about 10x leaders, one of the key components it talks about is productive paranoia, right? And I've said it before to loads of people, but I love this concept of productive paranoia, right? Because it's not paranoia like the majority of security teams. It's not just productive like the majority of operational businesses. It's a bit of both, right? And the true leaders and great leaders, and I think this goes for CISOs as well, have got a bit of both in them, right? So to your point, I think you're absolutely right. I think you've got to be as proactive as you can. You've got to, if you're talking about DevOps mentality, shift it as far left as you can. You've got to do all those things to make sure that you're being proactive and preventing where it is absolutely possible to do it. But also, you've got to be productively paranoid, and you've got to build the resiliency into your program and into your business that when it does happen, whether we agree it's when rather than if is up to the audience. But you've got to be prepared for the if and when, right? And you've got to build the resiliency into the business to be able to deal with it. Now, that can also be fine, and we talked about it earlier on, if that's insurance, right? And that's actually passing the risk to someone else. There's an element of that being a effective control in some cases. But then when you're talking about a SOC and responding, there's got to be that reactive approach as well. So there's no one size fits all. I've saved it till 18 minutes from the end, but it depends, Corey.
Yeah, I mean, real quick before you jump in, Chris, is that I just still think what we see is that you take an 80-20 rule, right? I think it's 80% of it is on the response we're going to get hacked. And if you're lucky, you got 20%. I would just think we just need to shift it to the other side of it. And that's just what I'm saying is 80%, how much can we stop? How much can we remediate and clean up? And so that we don't have to spend so much responding and have to have a huge SOC. I'd rather have a huge preventative team. Maybe that's just me. Chris, the one topic I got to get to you on is my pet peeve is POCs. Like literally, I have, the companies and friends of mine, and they're like 4 months into POCs on whatever technologies, right? And they're just comparing back and forth. And does that make any sense? How do you guys make that better for a customer? How can you make that better? Because you think about a security program, and the 4 months that it takes for most of these, how much are you wasting on securing your organization, on that time? I mean, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. There's a lot in that in your pet peeve there. I guess first and foremost, I think Craig teed this up so well. What works? Like, what are you POCing for? What are the goals? What are the specific? If you're talking about security technology, that you're, like I'm POCing this thing to see if it's going to work or not. What are your functional requirements you want to achieve? And what are you assessing that POC for? Like, there's a forward planning part of that I think, like having a threat informed strategy and using frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK to help you define, these are the things I want the POC to help me, I want to assess to solve for, I think is awesome. What I'm also seeing in the practitioner community now that are embracing these BAS concepts, I'm seeing two things that are really fascinating. One, I got customers on the vendor side, customers that buy Attack IQ, and they're folding it into their internal QC. We've had, for example, an EDR customer that, if you're familiar with MITRE evaluations, where MITRE is doing an understudy of products and emulating those behaviors to show the outcomes that come from that, very akin to what we do, frankly, but they're doing it in a more academic way. They're using our product to improve their tool as they enter evaluation. So when evaluations happens and MITRE's a third party reviews them, their product is optimized as possible for that. So it's actually raising their bar in terms of their QC program. Second, we're seeing the POC vendors bring Attack IQ in partnership with the customer, because the customer hasn't define that, what works, as Craig alluded to. So they say, well, look, here's an example of a known attacker TTP. Here's how the Russians, the Chinese, or whatever state-sponsored attacker would come at you. Here's what our product would do to defend against that. Let's run that in your environment and show you. And so now the POC process is definitive. It has success criteria, and you get a higher value assessment versus, marketing swag and a whole bunch of influence, which, is, I think, how most of us have bought products and a dartboard throw, which how most of us bought products in the past.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So another topic. So companies should pretty much stop pen testing, right? No need for that.
Not at all. I don't think that's true.
Say, well, why would I pen test when the pen tester gonna find one vulnerability, get in and say, hey, you compromised, and that's it.
Yeah. But again, this is why I try to say, there's no silver bullet that solves this problem that we've been talking about here for 40 minutes now. This is how do you change your organization to adopt a more threat-informed strategy, and how do you embrace the automation continuum and get more bang for your buck? And so here's what I tell people: use breach and attack simulation platforms to define the known commodity attacker behaviors. Every incident I've ever been involved with, it was hygiene. We knew what it was. We knew it was possible. Just something broke along the line. So make sure the hygiene, basic brass tacks things are working. Now, use automation to do that. Great. Now we've got, an attack IQ, making sure that we know all our core controls are working well. Now deploy the red team above that, working on things you didn't know about. Let them free think. That's what they're good at anyway. And so that's how you up-level the red team into, a more proactive and role that is of higher value to the organization versus running these commodity tests that we already know about. The automation we can automate some of that stuff. Let your red team, flourish in the higher thinking areas.
Have you ever found anyone clean, Chris? Have you ever walked away and gone, couldn't do anything? Perfect.
No. And in fact, it's terrifying. And one of the turn that thing off. I don't want to know. Yikes. The other is 15 to 20-year-old techniques that we all know about. And we should absolutely be defended against, are very successful. We also find.
Did you say that like you were going to surprise me?
Exactly.
Do I look surprised?
Not at all. Not at all. We also find a lot of really interesting, this all comes back to investment, right? Remember, security is an overhead function. You generate no revenue for the firm unless you're in the actual security industry.
Trust office.
You're a light bill, right? And every time the electricity bill goes up, CEO wants to know why and what you're doing. How are you justifying that investment? And so in being able to anchor back, I just spent $4 million on these new tools. Let me show you why that's good or why it wasn't good. Or holy crap, you just saved my ass because I spent $4 million and it wasn't working. Those are very, very powerful CISO influential things. And very unique. I'll give you another story. I got a customer, financial institution, new CTO walked in and is like, oh my gosh, I've got so much to do here. I've got to rebuild the technology organization. I got to rebuild the security organization. Tell me what you do, Chris. We worked together in the past, yada, yada. Explains dude, I'm not ready for that. I got to do all this other stuff. And again, my head explodes. You don't understand. How are you benchmarking what you have to do? What works, what doesn't? What decisions are you going to make about what you're going to replace and repair? How are you actually going to measure that? And how are you going to show your board and justify what you need? And then you see his head explode oh my God, I can actually create meaningful metrics using threat-informed strategies. I can actually map dollar spend to threat addressal, and I can use automation, this automation platform to demonstrate the success of that investment. His job's now 10 times easier.
Yeah, I mean, so Chris, just I mean, we're open up for questions. You guys have questions, jump in the chat. But here's the deal, though. For me, this is the challenge that frankly, I have at Savitar, and I think you guys have it at your company. Is you guys have hit something huge. Some companies have 20-year-old vulnerabilities that they haven't fixed, and if we spend time doing pen testing, that it has its place, but if you still have, they find one vulnerability and get in, which I think is always going to work. Like, and again, me coming from pen testing background, it's always going to work. Then you got CISOs that some, and I get it, no, because like I said, it makes sense. They don't want to know about the vulnerabilities because they can't fix it. And to your point, Craig, the fact that if you don't have IT asset management covered, you don't even know what you have, and then you only know what you're vulnerable to. It just, I see why it's stressful, and CISOs are drinking a lot. How do you
It's not just me. It's not just me. Chris is
okay, everybody else too, right here.
So I would say this, right? Just drawing it back. I know you guys want to stay in the vendor space and finding holes again, right? But drawing it back to internal and from my world for a second, right?
Yeah.
I know what I can influence and I know what I can do, right? So if a new CISO or a CISO is to come to me and to ask, right? And we've talked about it before, Corey. The hacking stuff, the finding the holes is really, really sexy. The guy that does the patching and does some good job for IT asset management isn't quite as sexy. Well, some of them are. I've seen some nice ones, but generally speaking, they're not all very sexy, right? And that job's not very sexy. So what you got to do as a CISO is almost ignore all that stuff that you guys are coming out with, right? And know what's right for your organization if you haven't even started with the basics. So get that list of CSE top 20 or whatever it is, right? Ignore the vendor bump for a minute at least and build a basic program from the ground up. Do IT asset management well, build a decent patching program. And yes, of course, you guys are always going to find holes, and I get that. But it's about limiting that bucket and limiting that attack service as best you can. And regardless, and I've been on a number of calls and webinars about COVID-19, we at Fujitsu have seen a huge uptick in phishing related emails as a result of, for our SOC that we run for customers and everything, as a result of COVID-19. But there's no getting away from the fact that the derivation of those threats and the controls that prevent those threats are still the basics, or the majority of them are still the basics. So if you've got good IT asset management, you've got good patching, there's a list that could go on and on and on. But if you're starting from the basics, you're not going to go too far wrong, in my opinion.
Appreciate it, brother. My only commentary to that is like continuous validation is an integral component to that. Like it's one thing to patch, it's another to validate the patch is effective.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So to that point, I've just sent a text to my good friend Justin Timberlake. We're gonna bring sexy back because that's the way to do it, right? And I think that's the problem. It's a cultural issue. Fixing shit is not sexy. It just
sexy patch.
Yeah, exactly. Bringing sexy patch and remediation back. It should be, because that's what matters, But that's the problem.
Well, yeah, I think I'm not getting lost, but I think we're getting a little narrow in like patching and like those are. I think what Craig's alluding to is that basic hygiene is still the things that kills most people, and so focus on those core things. And what I'm offering, what I think, is that now there's a better way to tell the story of why you need to do that. If I can take off the shelf known open source framework threat intelligence and weaponize that safely in your environment and show you that none of your shit is working, well then, holy crap, now all of a sudden hygiene's sexy again. And that's so powerful because that's what we're experiencing.
No, I gotta ask. Here's the deal. If I'm CISO, never been a CISO, but if I'm CISO and I've been there my standard 18 to 24 months, then you come in and tell me that all the shit I put in place for the last 18 to 24 months isn't working. How do I message that?
Well, have you ever heard the 3 envelopes joke? It's like it's always the previous guy's problem. Well, first and foremost, like, don't plan to be a 2-year CISO. Plan to be a successful one. A successful one always, if you're coming into a new organization, you need to start with a benchmark. Like, how are you going to measure your organizational performance? And a key part of measuring your organizational performance is instrumenting some form of testing to determine where you are. And so yeah, like it's core. Like, I don't want to call it a get out of jail free card. I've heard that language used before, but if I can present to you in a credible third party based way that nothing is working here, and here's my priorities that I'm going to fix first, that's a very compelling plan because it's measurable and tractable. And so it's a must do from my perspective. You come in, you learn the business, you set a benchmark, you create a plan, you execute. I mean, that's management 101.
Okay. Well, hey, we got 4 minutes left. I'll let you, Chris, summarize us and tell the overall value. Hopefully, this webinar told the overall value of your technology at Attack IQ. But I'll let you kind of jump in and do that quick summary.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. This is a lot of fun. I hope you guys invite me back. I certainly got a lot of war experience as well to bring to the table.
You drank last night.
The big message for me is that we're entering a new era of capability for the cybersecurity professional, and it's time to get smart on it, because to be successful in any kind of security leadership role, embracing this will be a key differentiator for you. Adopting threat-informed strategies and taking advantage of the bodies of knowledge that are out there about how threat actors operate, and then tying that into automation capabilities to validate your investment is good, and then connecting that to measurable metrics of your program are key. Attack IQ is a breach and attack simulation platform that allows you to both take advantage of these frameworks and execute these attacker emulations live in your production assets. So you can actually measure if your controls are effective or not. And control being end-to-end measurement, not just is the light on and blinking, but can I run exercises? Can I test my people? Can I make sure my IR plays are going to work? Can I actually begin teaching my organization to threat hunt? Can I then tie that back into what does that mean for my compliance remits, for my risk management remits, and how I'm managing risk to the board of directors? The time is now to start doing that if you want to maintain being successful. So thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
That was a great conversation. I definitely want to thank you and Craig and Terry. If I'm missing a question, I didn't see any questions pop up. And if I'm missing a question, please chime in, but let me know.
Nope, we haven't had any questions, so we're good here.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. I feel like we could have this conversation for like 4 hours. Maybe next time we'll have it on that street corner in Nashville and still record.
Yeah, baby.
Yeah, exactly. But again, thank you, Chris. This has been fantastic. It's been enlightening. I appreciate you fielding the hard questions, and same thing with you, Craig, being the other side of it from a CISO perspective and defending CISOs. And so it's been a great conversation. And like we said, we've recorded this, and it will be posted to YouTube. Terry, I'm sure there are a lot of details I'm not sharing. I'll let you kind of close this out here.
Sounds good. Let me share up a couple of things. Over in your chat pane, I made a couple things available to you from Attack IQ if you want to learn more about their platform. So the links are posted out there, and you can see what the names of them are right here. And secondly, if you have questions or and you want to reach out to us here at Cyvatar, there's a couple of ways that you can get in touch with us. Email address, Corey's LinkedIn profile, telephone number. You can also follow us out on Twitter and LinkedIn. Corey, over to you to wrap this up.
I think we're good. It's a wrap. Chris, like I said, I look forward to us getting back to normal, whatever the new normal will be, and sitting down, having some very strong IPAs and just talking shit about cybersecurity. So I appreciate your time.